Chris somehow knew what Sebastian was wearing in bed, what didn't happen, and even referenced the exact Hodryu to 06 a.m. window despite claiming he was in Memphis. Add his slip. Katie and I are guilty. The geofence suggesting his truck entered and left the area, and the dogs finding no scent trail, and a new hypothesis emerges. The event didn't begin outside the house, it began inside it, and the hours after weren't a search, they were a post-event cover. This changes everything about the case. The most structurally coherent hypothesis begins with the way Chris repeatedly reveals knowledge about the night Sebastian disappeared, knowledge he should not possess if he was physically absent. His own statements form the core of this discrepancy. 4 specific lines expose the informational breach. We saw what he went to bed in. Katie and I are guilty. I can answer those questions. And his repeated fixation on midnight to 6. These statements do not arise in response to direct pressure. They emerge unprompted, during moments when he attempts to guide, redirect, or neutralize the narrative. Their forensic significance lies in what they inadvertently disclose: access, awareness, and temporal familiarity inconsistent with an alibi of being out of state. The first statement, "we saw what he went to bed in," is analytically incompatible with the claim that he was in Memphis. The detail reveals familiarity with Sebastian's clothing at the time of the incident. It is also notable that no one in the household has ever produced a consistent description of what Sebastian supposedly wore when leaving the home. Despite this, Chris speaks with certainty about the clothing worn at bedtime. The asymmetry is critical. He expresses certainty when referring to a point in time he should not have witnessed, and uncertainty when referring to the alleged departure moment that should be easier to recall. This pattern is consistent with possession of unacknowledged first-hand information, meaning he observed Sebastian in that condition at a point after an internal event occurred. The second statement, "Katie and I are guilty," appears during a moment of hostility, when he reacts to criticism instead of addressing the underlying forensic issue. Though he quickly shifts to attacking the critic, he never retracts or corrects the phrase. In forensic linguistics, a joint guilt declaration presented without modification is never interpreted as rhetorical unless explicitly reframed. The absence of any such clarification reveals that guilt is linked in his mind to both himself and Katie, indicating shared awareness of an event that required concealment. The adjoining aggression serves as a behavioral distraction, not a correction. The third indicator, "I can answer those questions," regarding the period between midnight and 6 is structurally inconsistent with the alibi. If he was not present, he should have no ability to answer operational questions about that time frame. His repeated return to this window suggests involuntary cognitive anchoring. Individuals often gravitate toward the exact time frame in which a destabilizing event occurred, even while attempting to obscure it. His insistence on addressing this period signals that he perceives it as the critical locus where attention must be controlled. Across all 4 statements, his vocabulary reveals an unmistakable preoccupation with the interior timeline, specifically with situations occurring inside the house. This leads directly into the central hypothesis. The precipitating event took place indoors, not outside. Evidence pointing to an internal event begins with observations of Katie's behavior and phrasing. Her incomplete statement, "is already," accompanied by a gesture to the throat, indicates a moment of sudden recognition that Sebastian was no longer responsive. Such a truncated declaration combined with involuntary body language is characteristic of someone suppressing or redirecting a factual memory. It suggests that the incident did not involve a voluntary exit, but a medical or physical compromise occurring within the home environment. There are additional contextual indicators pointing toward a possible medical trajectory. Reports of sleep aids and the difficulty Sebastian had sleeping on previous nights create a plausible scenario of medication mismanagement, especially if stress, impatience, or fatigue were present. Improper medication use can lead to vomiting, airway obstruction, or a destabilizing fall. A fall-related injury during a period of reduced alertness is consistent with the sudden, unanticipated nature of the event implied by the linguistic patterns. While the exact trigger cannot be asserted, The data support a model in which Sebastian became incapacitated indoors, not in the surrounding environment. This internal event hypothesis is reinforced by an unbroken series of negative forensic indicators. There were no footprints, despite the ground providing conditions conducive to imprint formation. There was no scent trail detectable to professionally trained search dogs, an outcome only possible if the individual never traversed the external environment on foot. There was no camera footage capturing a departure, even though multiple cameras in the vicinity should have detected movement if it occurred. There was no mention of missing footwear, unusual for a nighttime outdoor walk. In totality, the forensic field is devoid of markers consistent with voluntary exit. The absence of all four classes of external indicators strongly converges on a single conclusion: there was no departure from the home. If the incident occurred inside, the next logical component is the post-event cover mechanism, the sequence of actions taken to construct and maintain the walked out narrative. This mechanism can be divided into four operational stages. Stage 1: recognition of the incident. The behavioral cues surrounding the midnight to 3 window point to a moment of discovery during these hours. External observations, such as unexpected interior lights, correspond with a heightened level of internal movement, inconsistent with the household's stated sleep schedule. The repetition with which Chris references this period underscores its investigative relevance. Stage 20. Contacting Chris or his return to the home. The possibility that Chris returned during the night aligns with both his statements and the behavioral importance he assigns to being able to answer questions. About the critical window. Indicators suggesting vehicular presence in the area introduce the potential for unacknowledged physical access. His language implies knowledge derived from observation rather than second-hand explanation. Stage 30. Removal of evidences. Chris repeatedly emphasizes the shallow depth of a specific pond, describing it in unusually precise terms. This obsessive minimization appears designed to preempt suspicion. However, behavioral overemphasis on a location often indicates earlier cognitive consideration of that location. Dog interest in the pond supports the possibility that objects, not a person, were placed there. This aligns with disposal of medication containers, clothing fibers, or other small physical items linked to the internal event. Stage 4C. Deployment of the walked out narrative. Once the internal event and cleanup actions were completed, the narrative of a voluntary departure likely became the operative cover. The narrative serves two strategic functions. It redirects focus outward, away from the true event location, or it decentralizes responsibility by appealing to an undefined external threat or unexplained behavior by the victim. This narrative requires the complete erasure of physical markers, which explains the aggressive insistence by Chris on what did not happen, rather than what did. From a forensic perspective, the inside event plus post-event cover model is the only hypothesis that coherently accounts for the totality of negative indicators. No scent trail suggests no foot-based departure. No camera movement suggests no exterior traversal. No footprints suggests no contact with soil beyond the home. No missing footwear suggests no preparation for an outdoor exit. No behavioral markers of voluntary runaway further support non-departure. Additionally, it aligns with behavioral data, linguistic leakage, hostility in response to factual scrutiny, preoccupation with specific time windows, and selective over-explanation. Other hypotheses such as voluntary departure, wandering, or external abduction require ignoring or dismissing critical forensic absences. The inside event hypothesis does not require bending any data. Instead, it fits each element into a coherent analytical structure. In sum, the first hypothesis establishes a critical investigative framework. Sebastian did not leave the home on his own. The event occurred inside, and the outward-facing narrative was constructed afterward to mask it. This model serves as the foundation for all subsequent forensic analysis. A second hypothesis emerges when examining the indicators surrounding movement into and out of the neighborhood during the night Sebastian disappeared. 2 devices were detected entering and leaving the area, one associated with a relative and one associated with Chris. The detail becomes significant not because it proves physical presence on its own, but because Chris himself acknowledges that his truck appeared within the geofenced region. If he was in Memphis, the appearance of his vehicle near the home would be impossible. If his location was misrepresented, the appearance becomes entirely consistent with a covert return, especially one occurring during the hours repeatedly emphasized in his own statements. This acknowledgement aligns with the behavioral patterns documented across several conversations. Chris often reveals information that should be inconsistent with his claimed absence. The geofence reference marks one of the clearest contradictions. He does not dispute that the truck appeared in the area. Instead, he treats the detail as if it were merely incidental. From an investigative standpoint, a vehicle linked to an individual entering a restricted radius during the narrow time frame of a disappearance is never incidental. It requires a causal explanation, and the explanation that he returned to the house during the night fits not only the geofence pattern, but also multiple linguistic and behavioral indicators. The timeline inconsistencies deepen the analytic weight of this hypothesis. Chris describes Sunday's events with confidence, recounting details that one would expect from a person who was physically present. Yet his stated timeline places him away from the home. When someone claims to have been absent yet displays informational familiarity about specific interactions, environmental details, or emotional context, analysts evaluate the probability of knowledge contamination information gained through direct involvement rather than secondhand communication. The specificity with which Chris discusses Sunday does not resemble reconstructed knowledge. It resembles experiential knowledge. This conflicts with the claim that he was traveling or already away. Compounding this issue is the widely referenced 3-hour phone call. If the goal was to maintain continuous contact with Katie across state lines, the duration raises logistical questions. Why was a 3-hour call required if physical presence was impossible? Why is the call used to support an alibi? Despite its incompatibility with the travel times, and with his own references to what occurred between midnight and 6, the conflict is not merely temporal, it is structural. A 3-hour call presents itself as an alibi, yet simultaneously supports the possibility of coordination during a critical period. Another timeline issue emerges when examining his claim that he cannot speak about Sunday, yet he repeatedly provides detail about it. Inconsistent restrictions claiming inability to comment, then proceeding to comment, are considered markers of narrative construction rather than spontaneous recollection. These discrepancies become more concerning when paired with the fact that Katie was asleep from midnight to 6. If she was unavailable and Chris was absent, then neither of them should be able to produce precise information about what did not happen during that window. Yet Chris repeatedly claims knowledge about the absence of noise, the impossibility of certain exits, and the unlikelihood of doors or windows being used. Information about negative events, things that allegedly did not occur, is especially telling. Absence of observable events can only be confidently stated by someone who witnessed the environment at the time. A person who was asleep or physically distant cannot state with certainty that he did not walk out the door, or that there would have been noise. Yet Chris delivers these negatives confidently. This confidence strengthens the second hypothesis. He was physically present during the period in question. Knowledge contamination becomes the central analytical category. Chris possesses several pieces of information that are difficult to reconcile with non-presence. The first is his familiarity with the clothing Sebastian went to bed in. Observers note that this detail surfaces repeatedly and is delivered without hesitation. While Katie's knowledge could be attributed to routine bedtime interaction, Chris's confidence cannot be attributed to the same. If he was out of state, his correct knowledge of the clothing suggests exposure at a time after the incident occurred. The second contaminated detail involves the retention pond. Chris emphasizes the water depth multiple times, describing it as knee-deep and less than 3 feet. The precision and repetition are analytically flagged because they appear without investigative prompting. It is uncommon for an uninvolved person to fixate on a location's limitations unless that location had previously been considered as part of an attempted solution or disposal. Dog interest in the pond further increases the relevance of the detail. If an object associated with the event was placed in the pond, Chris's knowledge of the depth could reflect first-hand familiarity gained during nighttime involvement. The third contaminated area involves his understanding of the sensory characteristics of the house during the disappearance. He insists that using certain doors would have been too loud, claims that specific windows would have created noise, and states that everyone would have heard it. This type of sensory certainty belongs to someone who was physically present, not to someone who was absent. His repeated emphasis on noise-based impossibilities implies acute familiarity with the conditions inside the home at the time. When combining geofence possibilities with timeline irregularities and knowledge contamination, a behavioral pattern emerges. It suggests that Chris may have returned to the home during the 2 or 3 a.m. window. This time frame aligns with the period in which interior lights were reported active and with Katie's description of being asleep. The absence of movement on cameras, the absence of scent trails, and the absence of footprints all converge toward the conclusion that an internal event occurred. The individual most capable of assisting in the removal of evidence or in handling the aftermath would be the individual who, by his own statements, could answer those questions. Based on this model, the hypothesis posits that Chris returned quietly, entered the home, and helped move either the body or items directly tied to the incident. It is unnecessary to assert intent. The focus remains on observable behavioral patterns. Once the immediate crisis was managed, the priority shifted to producing a coherent cover story. This likely included the emphasis on hypothetical wandering behaviors, misdirection toward windows or doors, and the portrayal of the event as an unexplained nighttime exit. This hypothesis also explains why Chris is aggressively protective of specific narrative elements. Individuals who return to an event scene after the fact often experience cognitive entanglement, the inability to separate what they witnessed from what they want others to believe occurred. This entanglement appears repeatedly in his explanations. He attempts to guide public interpretation, preemptively rejects alternative theories, and deploys confrontational language when challenged. The defensive posture is consistent with someone who participated in a post-event stage rather than someone reacting purely as an uninvolved relative. From an investigative standpoint, this second hypothesis offers a coherent explanation for all the major inconsistencies. It accounts for how Chris acquired detailed knowledge of events during a period when neither he nor Katie should have been awake or present. It aligns with the vehicle activity reported in the area. It resolves his overfamiliarity with interior conditions. It clarifies the unnatural confidence with which he denies external departure routes. And it integrates his repeated slip-of-the-tongue comments into a single behavioral framework. Most importantly, it addresses the central question: how does Chris know what he knows? The simplest answer is that he was physically present during the critical hours, participated in handling the aftermath of an internal event, and later contributed to shaping the narrative of a nighttime departure. Among all linguistic signals in this case, one statement stands out as the most consequential. "Was saw what he went to bed in." This short sentence contains the highest concentration of forensic value because it exposes knowledge that cannot be reconciled with the version of events in which Chris remained in Memphis throughout the night. Clothing knowledge is one of the cleanest analytical indicators in cases involving disputed timelines, because it follows a simple rule: a person can only know what they saw, what they were told, or what they inferred from physical evidence. In this situation, none of the legitimate pathways allow Chris to make this claim without contradicting his own alibi. To understand why this sentence carries such weight, it is necessary to examine its structure. The statement is declarative and collective. "We saw what he went to bed in." The focus is on direct visual confirmation. There is no qualifying phrase such as, "we assumed," "we were told," or, "as far as we know." It is an assertion of first-hand observation. For someone who claims to have been out of state, the use of "saw" is incompatible with physical absence. This alone places the sentence into the category of embedded admission, meaning a statement that reveals more than the speaker intends to disclose. Equally significant is the shift from "he went to bed in" to the context in which the phrase is used. The sentence is not offered while discussing bedtime routines. It is not used as a benign description of earlier events. Instead, it appears during an attempt to deflect questions, yet paradoxically reveals precise knowledge tied to the timeframe surrounding the disappearance. Because bedtime clothing becomes relevant only after an internal event, the ability to describe it with certainty suggests exposure to the condition of the body or bedroom after the critical moment, not before. From a forensic standpoint, this situation becomes even clearer when evaluated alongside the complete absence of descriptions about what Sebastian was supposedly wearing when he left. Households, in missing child cases, can usually provide at least a partial description of the last known outfit. Here, not only is there no consistent clothing description, Chris actively avoids producing one. He does not attempt to approximate, speculate, or express uncertainty. Instead, he pivots away from the question entirely. Avoidance is not neutral, it has diagnostic value. When a person refuses to describe something that should be simple, the absence of description often signals the absence of the event itself. In this context, it suggests that there was no departure outfit because there was no departure. The only clothing reliably referenced throughout the discussion is the bedtime clothing, precisely the detail Chris claims to see. This distinction is the basis for the contradiction. Chris speaks with certainty about the clothing he should not know, and with total reluctance about the clothing he should easily know if the narrative of an exit were accurate. The asymmetry aligns more closely with a scenario in which he witnessed the condition of the body or bedroom during the early morning hours following an unforeseen event. A second layer of analysis emerges from the environmental clues tied to the night in question. Multiple observers reference lights on around 3 a.m., a time when the household should have been asleep, and when Chris claims to have been away. Light activation during the early morning suggests internal movement, someone awake, moving from room to room, or entering from outside. When paired with the clothing statement, the lights become chronologically significant. The most straightforward interpretation is that whoever was present inside the house around 3 a.m. also had the opportunity to see Sebastian in the condition Chris describes. This correlation between timing and visual knowledge increases the probability that Chris returned during this window, which matches the hypothesis outlined earlier. Without physical presence, the level of detail he provides is unsupported. With physical presence, every contradiction becomes coherent. Further strengthening the contradiction is the selective nature of Chris's memory. He can recall specific details about bedtime clothing, precisely the information useful for constructing the idea that Sebastian left without shoes, without preparation, and possibly in a vulnerable state. Yet he cannot recall, estimate, or even theorize about what Sebastian wore during the supposed exit. This selective recall aligns with deliberate narrative shaping. It allows him to frame the departure as spontaneous, while simultaneously preventing investigators from matching clothing descriptions with search footage, witness accounts, or scent distribution patterns. The omission protects the narrative. The detail exposes his involvement. The forensic implications extend beyond the clothing itself. When a person references a visual detail that should be inaccessible to them, analysts treat it as a location marker, evidence that the person was physically present in a space they claim not to occupy. In this case, the statement marks proximity to the bedroom or to the body after the internal event occurred. Proximity, in turn, implies opportunity. Opportunity combined with knowledge contamination creates the strongest form of circumstantial alignment. The danger of the statement lies in its simplicity. Complex contradictions can sometimes be debated, this one cannot. A person cannot see something in a home hundreds of miles away. The only reasonable mechanism for Chris to know what he claims to have seen is physical return or involvement during the critical hours. Because the statement is delivered casually, without hesitation, and during an attempt to refute unrelated details, it fits the behavioral pattern of unconscious truth leakage, rather than intentional fabrication. Truth leakage tends to occur when cognitive load is high, when an individual is juggling multiple narrative elements and attempting to maintain control of the conversation. Additionally, The claim interacts with environmental negatives: no footprints, no scent trail, no camera capture, and no missing apparel consistent with a nighttime walk. If Sebastian left in the clothing he went to bed in, the scene should provide signs of an exit. It does not. If he left barefoot, scent trackers should have picked up a trail. They did not. If he left in pajamas, camera footage should show a reflective signature. It does not. The pajamas become a forensic anchor. They represent the last known, verifiable clothing condition, and that condition was observed by someone inside the house after the event. The clothing contradiction ultimately becomes the highest probability indicator that Chris had direct contact with the event environment. It reveals misalignment between claimed location and demonstrated knowledge. It signals exposure to the scene consistent only with physical presence. It connects to behavioral avoidance surrounding departure details, and it offers a coherent explanation for why the departure scene contains none of the normal traces associated with a child walking away. Taken together, these components create an unambiguous investigative conclusion. The clothing statement is not merely suspicious, it is operationally incriminating. It points to first-hand observation of the body or its surroundings, and it stands as the most dangerous slip because it shows that Chris did not simply reconstruct the scenario. He was present within it. The disappearance of a person from a residential structure, especially at night, typically leaves at least one measurable physiological trace, a scent trail. Human scent disperses consistently through friction, heat, skin shedding, and moisture transfer. When someone walks through grass, gravel, or soil, they create a detectable gradient that trained SAR dogs can follow for substantial distances. The only two scenarios in which a detectable scent trail does not occur are the person never walked out, or the person was transported by a vehicle, or carried in a manner preventing direct ground contact. These principles are foundational in search operations and heavily relied upon in reconstruction of the last known position. In this case, SAR teams unequivocally reported that no scent trail led away from the home. Their dogs did not identify any path, partial trail, broken trail, or scent pool outside the structure. Forensic specialists treat the absence of a scent trail not as an ambiguous finding, but as a strong affirmative indicator. It suggests the individual did not physically traverse the external environment on foot. When examining cases of alleged runaway behavior or nighttime wandering, scent is normally one of the earliest and most reliable leads. Its complete absence raises immediate investigative contradictions. Rather than addressing this contradiction, Chris redirects attention by attacking the individual who publicized the scent information. Instead of disputing the SR findings or offering an explanation for the lack of scent, he focuses on the messenger, using dismissive language and hostile framing. This technique, attacking the communicator rather than the content, is a recognized avoidance pattern. Individuals who cannot reboot the underlying fact often concentrate on discrediting the one who voices it. This shifts focus away from the evidence and toward interpersonal conflict, reducing scrutiny on the core issue. Chris also attempts to undermine the reliability of scent dogs by stating that they are only right 25% of the time. This assertion serves as another diversion. In professional environments, scent dogs undergo rigorous certification and are consistently validated across training environments, terrain types, and operational scenarios. While no dog is infallible, their accuracy rate is far above the figure he cites. More importantly, dismissing the dogs does not resolve the underlying forensic issue. If a person walked away from a house, scent should exist, regardless of whether one chooses to accept or reject the dog's performance in general. His criticism of their accuracy is not supported by operational standards and appears strategically deployed to deflect from the implications of the scent absence. The forensic logic remains uncompromised. A scent trail should exist unless the person did not travel by foot. This brings the analysis to the two possible mechanisms for a scent void. 1. The individual never left the house on foot. This aligns with the negative indicators discussed in earlier sections: no footprints, no camera activity, no environmental disturbance, and no missing footwear. The lack of scent is consistent with a model in which the event occurred indoors and no physical departure took place afterward. 2. The individual was removed via a vehicle or carried. Transport eliminates scent trails because the body does not contact the ground surface in a way that produces friction-based odor dispersion. This mechanism also aligns with the hypothesis that extraction occurred between midnight and 3, potentially following a return by a familiar person during the early hours. In either scenario, the lack of scent directly contradicts the narrative of a voluntary walk into the night. An additional behavioral layer emerges in the way Chris addresses the scent issue. His responses show agitation and rapid escalation. When the scent evidence is mentioned, he does not ask clarifying questions or provide counter-information. Instead, he shifts immediately into defensiveness and aggression. This pattern is consistent with a person perceiving the topic as dangerous to their narrative control. The scent paradox represents a threat because it is grounded in objective detection technology and canine behavior, neither of which can be easily reinterpreted. Chris's insistence on explaining what did not happen is also notable. He frequently argues that certain exits would have made noise, certain windows were not used, and certain paths were impossible. These statements attempt to construct a framework of negative possibilities, eliminating options, but they never address the positive forensic fact: no scent trail exists anywhere. Assertions about noise levels or window use do not explain the absence of olfactory evidence. In forensic reasoning, absence must be directly addressed. Indirect arguments about unrelated logistical points hold no evidentiary value. The shift from factual discussion to personal attack, combined with unfounded criticism of scent dog accuracy, intensifies the interpretative weight of the scent paradox. His refusal to address the core question why no dog found any trace suggests he recognizes that the only logical answers contradict his outward narrative. Silence on substance is replaced by noise on personality. Analysts categorize this pattern as avoidance signaling, an indicator of cognitive strain under the weight of contradictory facts. Additionally, Chris displays an unusual confidence in asserting that no one would have heard an exit, and that no exit occurred through certain pathways. He claims certainty about actions that, if he were absent or asleep, he would have no way to know. His use of negative assertions: he didn't go out that window, he didn't make noise, he wasn't seen on camera because he didn't go that way, positions him as a witness rather than a distant observer. That is the central problem. A person who was not present cannot rule out unobserved actions. His certainty becomes incriminating precisely because it is impossible for an absent individual to possess it. The scent paradox ties this behavioral pattern to a forensic anchor. If Chris's narrative were true, then one of two things should exist: a scent trail or video confirmation. Neither does. When asked to resolve this conflict, he focuses on irrelevant tangents. He never provides a viable explanation for the absence of scent, because any truthful explanation would require acknowledging that the departure did not occur. In forensic reconstruction, the absence of an expected indicator is treated as data equal in strength to positive physical evidence. A complete void, not a weak scent, not a broken trail, but absolute absence indicates that departure by foot was not part of the event sequence. This point alone undermines the entire walked out narrative. Thus, the no scent paradox advances the investigation in two important ways. It eliminates outdoor movement as a viable scenario. A child walking away leaves scent, period. Or it pressures the timeline inward. With outdoor departure removed, all significant activity must have occurred inside the home or through hidden transport. When combined with earlier contradictions, knowledge contamination, inconsistent timelines, overconfidence about unseen events, the scent paradox becomes one of the strongest forensic elements in the case. The conclusion follows cleanly: the absence of scent is not a minor anomaly. It is affirmative evidence that the narrative of a voluntary departure is false. And because Chris works hardest to weaken or distract from this specific fact, it becomes one of the clearest indicators that he recognizes its damaging implications. The retention pond emerges as a critical point of analysis, not because it contains direct evidence, but because of the unusual linguistic and behavioral emphasis placed on it by Chris. His repeated descriptions of the pond's depth, knee-deep, less than 3 feet, reflect a level of preoccupation that does not align with his stated position as a concerned step-parent searching for answers. In genuine search contexts, individuals rarely anchor on the depth of a water feature unless prompted by investigators. Here, however, the focus originates from Chris himself, and he introduces these details repeatedly, without solicitation. This pattern places the pond within the sphere of potential offender consideration, meaning it is a location he may have contemplated in relation to the event. The significance of the depth fixation extends beyond the mere numbers. When someone emphasizes that a location is too shallow to conceal a body, the phrasing often functions as a preemptive denial, crafted to eliminate suspicion before it forms. Such statements aim to close off investigative pathways, rather than follow logical progression. Analysts refer to this phenomenon as psychological distancing, a behavior in which the speaker attempts to distance themselves from a location, object, or method that they internally associate with risk. Distancing does not implicate the person by itself. Rather, it signals that the speaker has mentally engaged with the scenario enough to feel the need to redirect others away from it. Chris's comments exhibit this precise structure. He does not treat the pond as an irrelevant environmental detail. Instead, he fixates on its limitations, specifically its inability to hold a body. But the meaningful interpretation lies in why he brings up the question of holding a body at all. No one else is considering body concealment when he introduces the topic. His unsolicited dismissal of the pond's viability implicitly reveals that he has thought about the pond in exactly those terms. In neutral conversations, shallow depth is rarely mentioned unless the speaker is attempting to assure someone that nothing of significance could be hidden there. The behavior gains additional relevance when paired with the actions of search dogs. Dogs reportedly jump directly into the pond with notable urgency. This type of reaction is typically associated with the detection of an odor linked to an object recently introduced into the water. A body presence would leave broader olfactory patterns, but smaller evidence such as medication bottles, pill packaging, or cloth produces more localized scent pools that trained dogs can still detect. Such reactions increase the likelihood that an object, not a person, was placed in the pond. This possibility aligns with the earlier hypothesis that an internal event occurred. If medication misuse or overmedication were involved, one of the highest risk pieces of physical evidence would be the medication container itself. Packaging often carries fingerprints, residue, and quantifiable pill counts. A noticeable discrepancy between the prescribed quantity and the remaining contents would create a clear forensic contradiction. Disposal would therefore be a logical step for an individual attempting to prevent investigators from reconstructing the dosage timeline. The pond would present an expedient location for disposing of small but incriminating items, especially during nighttime hours. It is close enough to access quietly yet deep enough to obscure an object when lighting conditions are poor. In such scenarios, the offender's priority is not concealment of a body, something requiring depth, weight, and time, but rather accelerating the destruction or separation of material that could directly link them to an internal event. The shallow depth becomes irrelevant for small object disposal, but highly relevant for why a speaker might feel the need to emphasize its inability to conceal a body. They are arguing against a suspicion that has not yet been presented. Chris's insistence on discussing the pond's depth, therefore, does not eliminate the pond as a point of interest, it enhances it. Analysts note that offenders often attempt to neutralize a location by providing overconfident explanations for why the location is irrelevant. These explanations frequently contain technical inaccuracies or exaggerated certainty. In this case, describing the pond as only knee-deep is less important than the repeated effort to emphasize that depth. It indicates an internal reasoning process around the pond's suitability for certain actions. In addition to the depth fixation, Chris's emotional tone when discussing the pond shifts into a defensive register. His comments become more forceful, as if he perceives the pond as a topic requiring management or containment. Behavioral shifts like this are analytically significant. When a speaker transitions from neutral commentary to defensiveness around a location, it suggests the location holds personal cognitive weight either because the speaker has considered using it or because they fear others might suspect they used it. The pond also appears repeatedly in discussions about scent detection. While Chris contests the reliability of scent dogs, he is noticeably uncomfortable when acknowledging the dog's interest in the pond. This avoidance suggests he recognizes that the dog reaction contradicts the "walked out" narrative. A typical departure by foot should produce a trail that moves away from the house into open areas, not terminate at a water feature near the property. Yet here, the dog's strongest reaction aligns with a location Chris emphasizes preemptively. The convergence of his psychological distancing and the dog's behavior strengthens the hypothesis that the pond is connected to the event, not as a site of body disposal, but as a site of evidence disposal. Another notable pattern emerges when evaluating how Chris frames the pond relative to the overall disappearance. He repeatedly asserts that the pond cannot be linked to a body because its depth would make concealment impossible. He does not, however, address whether the pond could contain smaller objects. This selective argumentation is another form of narrative steering, where the speaker chooses a version of events that eliminates the most dangerous possibility while ignoring more plausible, equally incriminating alternatives. By focusing the listener's attention on the impossibility of hiding a body, he obscures the possibility of discarding evidence, an act that carries significant forensic weight without requiring logistical complexity. The omission is strategic, admitting that the pond could hold objects invites follow-up questions about what objects might have been placed there. His silence on this point is therefore as important as his speech. Additionally, the pond holds symbolic weight within the sequence of events. If the internal event occurred during the night, the next logical concern would be determining how to handle any physical remnants that could be used to establish a medical or accidental cause. Medication bottles, stained clothing, or items associated with cleanup would all constitute high-risk evidence. Disposing of such items locally rather than transporting them elsewhere minimizes exposure risk and reduces time spent moving around the community at night. The pond would serve this purpose effectively. Collectively, the evidence suggests the pond was not used to conceal a body, but was considered and possibly used as a location to dispose of incriminating objects associated with the internal event. Chris's behavior around the topic is consistent with someone attempting to distance themselves from a location they psychologically associate with wrongdoing. The depth emphasis, the unsolicited denials, the emotional defensiveness, and the failure to address alternative forms of disposal all point in one direction. The retention pond becomes meaningful not because of what is found there, but because of how Chris responds to it. When a person repeatedly attempts to neutralize suspicion toward a place, unprompted and without external pressure, that place warrants analytical focus. In this case, the pond likely marks a step in the post-event sequence, specifically the removal of small but critical evidence. Forensic reasoning therefore supports the following conclusion: the retention pond is best understood as a disposal site for material evidence, not as a burial or concealment location. And the only reason this pond enters the narrative is because the individual most directly connected to the timeline brings it into focus, repeatedly revealing, through his own behavior, the possibility that he once considered it, or used it, in the aftermath of the internal event. In disappearance investigations, the period of time that receives the greatest unprompted attention from a subject often reveals more than any formal statement. Here, the window between midnight and 6 a.m. functions as the most revealing temporal focal point. Chris returns to this time frame repeatedly, more frequently and more forcefully than any other individual connected to the case. His insistence on referencing, defending, and explaining this window becomes an analytical marker, because this 6-hour span is precisely the one he claims not to have witnessed. The paradox is clear: he emphasizes the time frame he is supposed to know nothing about. Chris's statement, "I can answer those questions," is the most consequential example. The sentence is delivered in reference to events that occurred during the early morning hours. Yet, according to his own account, he was not physically present in the home. Knowledge of what occurred inside the house during these hours would require one of two conditions: presence or communication with someone who was present and conscious. Neither condition is satisfied. Katie states she was asleep. Chris states he was in Memphis. No other household member is listed as having been awake. This creates a closed environment in which no one present claims to have observed anything, and the one person who claims knowledge is also the one who claims physical absence. When someone speaks confidently about a period in which they have no legitimate observational access, analysts classify the statements under temporal overreach, a pattern where a speaker asserts more information than their stated position allows. Temporal overreach is significant because it indicates an internal conflict between what the speaker believes needs to be true and what the evidence would show if examined without distortion. The early morning window carries the highest risk for an offender because it is the period during which internal events, cleanup activities, or extraction efforts are most likely to have occurred. Therefore, the individual involved must work harder to control how others perceive that period. Several behavioral signals emerge in Chris's treatment of this time frame. First, he attempts to offer absolute statements about what did not happen during the early morning: which doors were not used, what noises were not made, and what movements did not occur. Statements of negative certainty require either observation or participation. They cannot be logically constructed from absence. If he was not present, he cannot assert that a door would have made too much noise, or that everyone would have heard it. Someone who slept through the event or someone who was in another state cannot credibly eliminate possibilities in this way. The ability to describe negative events implies first-hand familiarity. Second, the repeated emphasis on this time frame mirrors a well-documented psychological pattern in which individuals repeatedly revisit the point at which their internal narrative diverges from the factual chain of events. They return to it not because they understand it better, but because it is the point that requires the most narrative management. When the mind attempts to maintain a constructed scenario, the moment of divergence becomes the cognitive anchor, the point that requires the most repair. Chris's frequent return to the Hodred to Zor 6a mem window suggests that this period represents the moment of destabilization he is trying to conceal. Third, the early morning hours correspond with environmental observations that contradict the official narrative. A notable detail involves lights being on around 3 a.m., a time when the household should have been asleep. Light activation during this period suggests internal activity, someone moving from room to room or someone entering the home. In either case, the activity aligns with the time frame Chris repeatedly references. The light pattern matches the behavioral pattern, both converge on the same critical window. The significance of the 3 a.m. marker increases when viewed alongside other inconsistencies. If this was the moment the internal event was discovered, it would also be the moment at which decisions had to be made about handling the situation. The hours following an unexpected event are crucial for determining whether the response is immediate disclosure or concealment. When concealment occurs, the window between recognition and sunrise becomes the operational period for any extraction or cleanup. At this point, the offender's primary goals would include preventing detection, reducing noise, and eliminating physical traces. The absence of scent, footprints, and camera activity corresponds with such an internal, controlled response rather than an uncontrolled, spontaneous departure by the victim. This brings the analysis to the central implication. The Hodred to 06 a.m. window aligns precisely with the likely timing of both the internal event and the subsequent extraction. If the individual responsible returned during these hours, as suggested by earlier hypotheses, then this is the window in which they entered the home, assessed the situation, and participated in the removal of evidence. This is also the window Chris most strongly attempts to influence when speaking. Another notable feature of his language is his attempt to reconstruct the early morning timeline on behalf of others. He explains Katie's behavior, describes the house conditions, and clarifies the absence of noises or movements. This type of reconstruction crosses into the territory of narrative ownership, meaning he assumes the authority to define what happened in a period that should belong exclusively to the individuals who were present and awake. Yet, the only person awake and aware enough to construct a timeline appears to be Chris, contrary to his own claim of being away. The narrative ownership is reinforced by his pattern of inserting himself into the investigative reasoning of others. When discussing the possible routes or behaviors, he often positions himself as the arbiter of what is realistic, what is possible, and what should or should not be considered. This is unusual for someone who allegedly possesses no first-hand knowledge. A person with no access to the event window typically expresses uncertainty or defers to those who were present. Chris does the opposite. He dominates the timeline discussion and rejects alternative interpretations with force. This suggests an internal confidence that does not match an external absence. The early morning window is also the point at which he expresses the strongest emotional responses. Challenges relating to this time frame elicit irritation, deflection, and at times hostility. Emotional reactivity of this kind marks the window as high risk within the narrative structure, meaning it is the period he feels must be defended or obscured. The defensive posture indicates sensitivity, and sensitivity in this context indicates proximity to the truth. Forensic interpretation of the 100 to 06 AM window rests on three pillars: logical absence of legitimate observational access, presence of unsolicited and incompatible knowledge, and alignment with environmental inconsistencies such as light activation and lack of scent trails. When all three pillars align, the early morning hours become the most probable period during which the incident occurred and during which the response was managed. No other time frame fits both the linguistic patterns and the physical evidence. Therefore, the significance of Chris's repeated reference to these hours is not accidental. It reflects a cognitive attempt to control and reshape the most dangerous period of the timeline. The more effort he invests in defining what happened or did not happen during these hours, the stronger the inference that he had direct exposure to the events unfolding within them. The 100 to 06 AM window is not a gap in knowledge, it is a point of concealed knowledge. And the individual most determined to control how that window is understood is the individual most likely to have been present during it. One of the most revealing behavioral patterns in this case is the extent to which Chris devotes time and energy to describing what did not happen. Instead of reinforcing verifiable facts or clarifying gaps in the timeline, he repeatedly constructs elaborate explanations for scenarios that no one has proposed, no one has witnessed, and no forensic findings support. This pattern, known in forensic psychology as over-explanation, is a recognized indicator of narrative manipulation. It signals that the speaker is attempting to fill the space with hypotheticals to prevent attention from settling on the events that truly matter. Chris discusses non-events with remarkable detail. He speaks about Sebastian supposedly climbing out of a window, despite there being no evidence of window use, no marks on the screens, and no environmental disturbance consistent with such a climb. He brings up flower beds, insisting that anyone stepping into them would have created noise, left compression marks, or disturbed the soil. He spends time describing how certain doors would have made too much noise for a child to open, even though there is no evidence suggesting any attempt to use them. He emphasizes that walking barefoot at night would have produced audible sound or environmental transfer, despite the absence of any such trace. In each of these examples, Chris is not responding to investigative pressure. He is generating alternative scenarios independently. The flaw in these explanations is structural. Forensic investigators do not determine what happened by eliminating every possible negative scenario. They determine what happened by identifying the scenario supported by evidence. Chris's emphasis on improbable negative scenarios that leave no prints, no scent, and no physical markers acts as a diversion from the lack of evidence supporting his own narrative. This tactic becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of behavioral asymmetry. Innocent individuals typically highlight evidence that supports reality, what they heard, what they saw, what they know. Guilty individuals, or individuals attempting to conceal involvement, often focus on denying possibilities rather than confirming facts. This is because the truth, if spoken directly, would expose contradictions. When someone spends a disproportionate amount of time defining what did not occur, It is often because they are unable to articulate what did occur without revealing their role. Chris's over-explanations follow a consistent structure: introduce an implausible scenario, e.g., climbing out a window. Provide a series of reasons why the scenario is impossible, noise, visibility, structural limitations. Imply that because the scenario is impossible, no alternative explanation aside from his narrative remains. This structure is not accidental. It attempts to rewrite the logic of the investigation. By framing the case around a series of negative hypotheticals, he positions his own narrative, however unsupported, as the only viable option. This is a classic manipulation strategy. Eliminate imaginary possibilities to force acceptance of a preferred storyline. A notable escalation occurs when his narrative control is challenged. Instead of addressing factual contradictions, Chris resorts to intimidation, including threats such as wanting to beat the out of Tony. This reaction is not simply emotional volatility, it is a defensive behavioral response triggered when his narrative infrastructure is threatened. Intimidation serves two purposes. It discourages others from questioning him and creates an emotional atmosphere that distracts from the factual weakness of his position. Aggressive responses in investigative contexts often arise when the speaker faces evidence or reasoning that cannot be refuted. Rather than addressing the point directly, the speaker attempts to reassert dominance or control through forceful behavior. The threat does not answer any question. It simply disrupts the flow of analysis. This behavior is inconsistent with someone whose account is accurate and who welcomes scrutiny as a means of clarifying truth. Innocent individuals typically remain anchored to factual consistency. Guilty individuals typically remain anchored to narrative preservation. The link between over-explanation and intimidation becomes apparent when viewing the broader pattern light. Chris talks at length about scenarios that are irrelevant, dismisses factual contradictions without analysis, and reacts aggressively when pressed for clarity. This triad: irrelevant detail, avoidance of evidence, and emotional escalation is recognized as a defensive posture around a concealed truth. One of the most telling aspects of his behavior is how he frames impossibilities as definitive evidence. For instance, he insists that a particular door would have been heard if opened. But when asked how he knows that, given his claimed absence, he does not provide an explanation. He insists that walking barefoot outside would always leave detectable markers. Yet the absence of these markers should lead to the conclusion that no walk occurred, not to the reinforcement of an unproven exit narrative. The function of these over-explanations is not to clarify the event, but to overwhelm the listener with a series of arguments that sound definitive but lack evidentiary grounding. This creates cognitive saturation. When a person hears too many hypotheticals, they become less able to isolate the key forensic elements. Chris's method relies on volume of speech rather than quality of information. He floods the conversation with negations until the core contradiction that none of the physical indicators support an outdoor departure becomes obscured. From a forensic standpoint, the focus on what didn't happen becomes as revealing as any physical trace. Individuals who had no involvement typically avoid speculating about negative scenarios. They focus instead on providing the clearest account of what they observed. In contrast, individuals with concealed involvement often construct a field of impossible alternatives to bury the truth. The more elaborately they describe these negative scenarios, the more they expose their underlying fear that investigators may eventually identify what did happen. Another analytical layer emerges from the predictability of his deflections. When confronted with contradictions in scent evidence, clothing knowledge, or timeline inconsistencies, Chris does not respond with factual corrections. He shifts to unrelated non-events: windows, flower beds, noise levels. This pattern suggests that he uses these scenarios as prepackaged escape routes whenever the conversation approaches high-risk territory. The speed and frequency of these shifts indicate they are not improvisational but habitual. This behavior also reveals that he understands which elements of the case could expose his involvement. He avoids discussing the internal timeline, internal evidence, or behavioral inconsistencies. Instead, he steers attention outward to hypothetical routes and physical obstacles. This outward focus masks the need to explain the inward facts: no scent, no movement, no departure indicators, and no consistent explanation of how he obtained the knowledge he repeatedly claims. The logical conclusion is that over-explanation functions as a shield, a linguistic barrier constructed to prevent examination of the internal event. By convincing listeners to focus on what could not have happened, he prevents them from examining what must have happened. Every window, door, footstep, and noise pattern he describes is a decoy designed not to inform, but to obscure. Therefore, the forensic interpretation is clear: the effort to describe non-events reveals more than the events themselves. A person committed to truth describes truth. A person committed to narrative protection describes everything except truth. Chris's persistent over-explanation is not an analytical dead end, it is a diagnostic signal. It shows that the scenarios he talks about are not the ones that matter. And more importantly, it shows that the scenario he avoids is the one that does. Every disappearance investigation reaches a point where physical evidence stops speaking. When footprints do not appear, when scent trails do not exist, when cameras show no movement, and when objects leave no trace, the case does not end, it simply moves into a different dimension of analysis. At that stage, investigators shift from reading environments to reading people, their language, their behavior, their inconsistencies, and the gaps between what they claim to know and what they should be capable of knowing. This case demonstrates exactly why that transition is necessary. One of the central lessons here is that when physical traces vanish, narrative traces emerge. The absence of external indicators does not imply an absence of information. It implies that the relevant information lies in verbal patterns, behavioral reactions, and timeline irregularities. A person who is reconstructing an event they genuinely witnessed tends to focus on what happened. A person who is reconstructing an event they need others to believe tends to focus on what did not happen. Chris illustrates this distinction repeatedly. His slips reveal inadvertent truths, while his over-explanations reveal deliberate avoidance. His silence on key details speaks as loudly as his insistence on unnecessary ones. This leads to the second investigative lesson. An offender's words often betray them not through confession, but through construction. A guilty person attempts to define the range of possibilities for others, limiting what alternatives can be considered, dismissing certain questions outright, and shaping the narrative structure so that attention is redirected toward improbable scenarios. The more aggressively they defend the structure, the more likely the structure serves a protective purpose rather than an explanatory one. In this case, efforts to define what was impossible: door noise, window routes, barefoot walking, flower bed disturbances, act as a shield against the question that most threatens the narrative. How does Chris know what he knows? Despite the extensive analysis already possible, several elements remain: missing pieces of information that could significantly narrow the range of explanations and either validate or disprove the hypotheses outlined earlier. The first missing element is the pre-interview recording in which Chris reportedly discusses traveling to Memphis, returning, and leaving the home at various times. Without the original recording, it is difficult to evaluate the exact phrasing, the sequence of statements, and the context in which contradictions emerged. The order in which details are offered often reveals whether they originate from memory or fabrication. The absence of this recording leaves a gap that could otherwise confirm or refute the timeline models. The second missing component is Wi-Fi device logging correlated with the geofence data. If two devices entered and exited the local network around the time in question, and if one of them aligns with a device associated with Chris, this would strengthen the argument for physical presence during the critical hours. Wi-Fi logs can provide exact timestamps, signal strengths, and device identifiers, all of which can establish whether someone was near the property when they claim to be elsewhere. The existing information raises the question. The missing logs could answer it. A third unresolved point concerns the object detected by the search dog in the retention pond. The dog's behavior suggests that something carrying human scent or residue was placed in the water. If that object were linked to medication, bedding, or clothing fibers, it would provide significant corroboration of the internal event model. Identification of the item could also answer whether it was discarded to hide dosage irregularities, wipe away blood or vomit, or obscure other biological traces. Without knowing the nature of the object, analysts are left to interpret only the dog's reaction, rather than the supporting evidence that reaction normally leads to. Because the case currently lacks these crucial elements, the next logical step is community involvement. Many disappearance cases evolve not through breakthroughs in forensic technology, but through recovered recordings, preserved screenshots, or digital traces saved by individuals who witnessed early stages of the investigation. In this situation, several types of publicly held material could meaningfully advance the analysis. Individuals who heard or recorded the pre-interview may hold the most valuable missing piece. Even brief audio segments could clarify Chris's language, confirm whether certain contradictions were spontaneous or rehearsed, and reveal whether his timeline aligns with the behavioral patterns observed later. Those who captured screenshots from live streams that have since been deleted may also possess critical evidence. Deleted content often includes unguarded statements, early narratives that shift later, and spontaneous remarks that reveal more than structured interviews. Screenshots can preserve wording, facial expressions, or contextual information that is otherwise irretrievable. Anyone who possesses vehicle timeline data or observations from the night of the disappearance, headlights, engine sounds, unusual traffic patterns, or parked vehicles could help verify whether Chris or another individual returned to the area. Even small-scale information, such as remembering whether a particular vehicle was present earlier or later than usual, can provide structural support for evaluating the likelihood of a nighttime return. These contributions are not about assigning blame, they are about clarifying inconsistencies and reconstructing the truth where physical evidence fails. The case's complexities demand a multi-layered approach, one built on logic, linguistic analysis, behavioral assessment, and precise reconstruction of timelines. Every piece of missing data increases ambiguity, every recovered piece removes it. The final and most important component of this chapter is the open question for viewers and analysts. If Chris was truly in Memphis, why do all the impossible forensic outcomes align perfectly with what only he appears to know? The absence of footprints aligns with his insistence on footwear improbabilities. The absence of scent aligns with his dismissal of canine reliability. The absence of camera evidence aligns with his assertions of unseen exits. The knowledge of pajamas aligns with his claim of visual confirmation. The preoccupation with the pond aligns with concerns about evidence. The fixation on midnight to 6 aligns with the likely operational window. These alignments cannot be explained through coincidence alone. They point to a convergence between his knowledge and the actual event sequence, a convergence that should not exist if he were genuinely uninvolved and physically absent. The question is therefore not merely rhetorical, it is investigative. It asks the audience to consider why the only person who should know nothing about the early morning hours knows more about them than anyone else. It asks why his explanations fit a scenario requiring internal knowledge rather than external observation. It asks why his narrative relies on defining negative possibilities instead of addressing positive facts. And ultimately, it asks viewers to consider what information they might hold: saved recordings, timeline observations, or overlooked details that could bring clarity to a case defined by its contradictions.